Hey everybody, so I'm doing this one to talk about the requirements for your CSS. Alright, so this is just going to be a short one. We're going to take a look at the HTML and CSS from the last video. So the HTML is from the last video, and I'm just going to go over what's in the CSS and tell you what's required and not required. So this should be a pretty short one. Alright, okay, so this is the last part of the video that you just watched about the HTML requirements. We have the main heading that just scrolled by. We have a picture. There was a horizontal rule above it. And as it scrolls, you'll start to see the other parts of the page. On the right is the HTML itself. Down at the bottom, we've got the what I do subheading, the 3 paragraphs of text. We have other subheadings. So these are H2 headings, and this is an H3 heading. The top heading was an H1 heading. We have a list, and then below the list we have another horizontal rule, and finally we have the citation at the bottom. So those were the things that I was requiring on the HTML part. As far as the list goes, that was one of your options. The other option is to do a table. You need at least one list. More than one list is probably better if you have information that you want to share, right? But the idea is you're making an About Me page. So now this video is going to go into what your CSS requirements are and how that's going to work for you. Okay, so this is the same HTML document that was opened up, but I added in the CSS that I included in mine. So all that's new and has changed is this section here that I added in. And what that's done is it's helped format my page. The other thing I did was I took out one of the subheadings because I felt that it was redundant to have 2 subheadings there if I wasn't going to have multiple things under the H2 heading. Having just one H3 under the H2 didn't make much sense there. So I just took out the second H2 heading. But other than that, it's the same exact document, and you just saw what that looked like. We're going to take a look and see what this looks like. But let's just go through the CSS here first. So the one main requirement is that you have CSS. So in order to do that, you need an HTML tag called style with an attribute type equals, and in quotes, text/CSS. And down at the bottom of that, you have this closed style. If you don't have that, then you don't have a CSS section and you will lose your points for the CSS. All right, so that is the main requirement for having your CSS. As far as any of these go, the H1s, all these selectors, H1 image, H2, H3, H2 and H3 separately, the div 1 and div 2, paragraph, unordered list, cite, any of those things, those are essentially optional in a sense that you don't have to use each and every one of them. And what you do have to do is you have to format and make your page artistic looking. So what I want to do is just briefly go over what I did with each section here. To my H1 heading, it was just black and it was in the standard typeface that comes with HTML. I gave it a color for the typeface of green, just a bright green, 00FF00. I gave it a font family, which is the same as your typeface, as brush script MT. I put a font size to pump it up much bigger. I did 80 pixels. You can do pixels or points or whatever size tool you want. And you'll see down lower I did points instead of pixels at places. Text shadow, I added a drop shadow to that, and I added some padding around it to make some space. I also, down in here, centered it here and here. The reason for centering it there is because aligning center is a little trickier with text than it is with boxes and things like that. We could do it in the CSS, but I just figured since we have a very simple alignment tool in the HTML that I threw that in down there instead. All right, so that is the H1. Let's take a peek and see what that looks like. All right, so just adding that little bit of CSS that we see right above here for the H1. Turned it from a pretty dull, boring looking heading to a really bright and vibrant, pop off the page kind of heading. Notice the green background. We'll see that in the body tag. It's right above the H1 tag here. I started with H1, but the body tag is there, and all I put in the body tag was the background color. So I get this dark, deep green in the background with the bright green font that I wanted to pop off the page and make it really stand out, and I added a drop shadow behind it. And that's what all of this stuff does. And I centered it. All right, so that is that section. Again, it is not required that you do any of this stuff. You do have to do something artistic with your letters. So you probably will want an H1 selector, but there are other ways you can do this without having an H1 selector as well. You could put it in a div, you could do all kinds of other things. So you're not going to lose points if you don't have an H1 selector, but that's probably the easiest way to format your H1. So I would request that, unless you have another way to do it, that you use the CSS to create that sort of a selector and give it some properties and values. All right. You're also required to have at least one image on your page. And what I did here was I formatted it to have it, instead of aligning to the right, like it does by default, to float to the left. I put some margin around it. I rounded the corners of the page. I changed the size. I gave it a width of 450 pixels so it wasn't so huge in the middle of the page. I floated it right. I added some margins around it to move it down from the horizontal line. It was almost touching the line, and also to give it some space around it in all directions. I gave it a box shadow, which box shadow, instead of text shadow, adds a drop shadow under the box that the image fits into or that the words fit into. I put a box shadow there. I gave it a border radius, so I rounded the corners there, and a border style, which is solid. So it's got a little bit of a thin line around it. The line is purple because, if you remember correctly, this is one of my hyperlinks. So if I clicked on that, it would go to another page. So far we've got the body, the H1, and the image covered. Again, you don't have to have any of these tags, but I do want you to format those images with CSS, so you're probably going to need them. Okay, so my subheadings are H2s and H3s. This is the one H2 heading, and this is the H3. There are things I wanted them to both have in common. So I did an H2 and comma H3 selector, so it's selecting both of them. And that is the brush script and the color. I wanted those to be the same. So for that I have sort of a yellow color to get some nice visibility against this dark green background for both. And the font family, or the typeface, is brush script MT, which is the same as this one up here. So since I was doing both the same, I did that as one selector, so that if I wanted to add some H2 headings or H3 headings, they would all have those properties. And then I went on separately for things I wanted different. So the font size for H2, I wanted 30 points to make it a little bigger. And the font size for H3, I wanted 24 points. So I had to do those separately. If I put them in here, they would both be the same size and there wouldn't be any difference between an H2 and an H3. Also, I wanted to give this some margin on the left. Instead of it hovering all the way over here, I wanted it to be in line with this text here. And what I knew there is I had a padding here of 10 pixels and a margin on the outside of 10 pixels here. So that's 20 pixels. So on my H2 heading, to line it up with my text, I gave it a margin on the left of 200 pixels. We'll see how we got this in the center in a minute. While I'm in this section, I'm going to skip over the div 1 for now, and I'm going to go to the paragraphs. So I've got the 3 paragraphs, and what I wanted in common on the 3 paragraphs is that I wanted them to have the same font, which was our second font we picked out, which was Verdana. I wanted to include a font size of 14 points, so it is significantly smaller than this. But what you'll find is brush script MT looks smaller than Verdana does. Even though it's physically larger on the page right now, it's still looking just a little bit larger than that. And that's because of the heights of the letters, the ends, so forth. I wanted to be sure this looks more like a heading and this looks more like text, so I made this the script font, and I made this the very readable sans serif Verdana font. So that I wanted to be built into the paragraphs. I wanted that size to be 14 points, again smaller than this 24 points here. And I wanted to align it so that it justifies. And when it justifies, and you'll see when if I bring this out a little bit, what you'll see is I have my padding here on all sides. And notice how straight and even this side, the top, the left side is straight up and down, and I have the right side straight up and down. Normally what would happen is the left would be straight up and down, the top would be straight up and down, but the right would be jagged in and out, depending upon the length of the words. And the way I do that is to add this text align justify, so that it looks nice and neat and even inside that box. To talk about what the divs are, I added 2 divs into the HTML. We'll look over here down a little bit. So if you see around the paragraphs here, This one starts with div, and I gave it an ID called div1, and I closed the div here around the 3 paragraphs. That was to make all 3 paragraphs go inside that box. I wanted the 3 paragraphs to be aligned inside one box. If I just put the boxes with the background colors inside the paragraph tag, what I would get would be each paragraph would have a separate box. But since these are all connected into one section that's under the What I Do heading, I wanted them all to be in one box. So to accomplish that, I had that ID I put in. You add the pound sign to tell it's looking for an ID. The one called div1, I wanted that to have a background color of this green here. 00CC00 is a bright green, but not as bright as this green up here. The color of the text, I went with a dark green. It almost looks black, but 003300. The font weight is bolded. So for all 3 paragraphs, I could have done the color and the weight in the paragraph tag as well. That would have come out the same. I wanted my box to only go halfway across my page, so I did 50%. It's a little more than halfway across, and that's because I have this 10 pixel margin over here. So really the center of the page is somewhere around here. The border style is solid, so I gave a solid black line around it. And the border radius, I could have put a border color if I wanted to. The border radius is 5%, gives a little rounded corners, just like I did on the picture. I was able to add some rounded corners. And you can adjust those rounded corners, and I adjusted the margins around it. I put 0 here because there's already a good amount of space between here and the paragraph, but I want it to stay connected. So I wanted it to be the closest thing to here, so the subheading and this box seem to go together. I want to increase the spacing over here. So the way this margin works is 0's at the top, 50 pixels at the right is in between the text and the edge of the picture. But the edge of the picture also has some pixels in there. 100 pixels on the bottom, so that added 50 more pixels down here to make this look like it's not connected to the box. It's more connected to this section over here. So it keeps them separate just by adding a little more space. So that's the bottom. So top, right, bottom, and then the left is 100 pixels. That's this space. So that was div 1, and div 2 is actually down over here. Before we go to this section, let's just look at what I did over there. So I gave that a width of 500 pixels, and by doing that, I was able to center this box. Because if the box is going all the way across and I put my margins as auto, what happens is the box won't go anywhere. It won't float in the middle because it's already all the way out to the edges. So I have to give the box a width. There is no visible box here. I could have made it a visible box, but I think that's overkill. So by putting the margins at auto, especially the left and right margin, that centers it more on the page. And I gave it some padding in order to keep these in line. I didn't want to center this text because that would make my bullets way out of line. What I did was I put some padding. So to the top I had 0 padding to keep these close together so that they fit together. To the right I had 0 padding because in a 500 width box that kind of is way out over here. I didn't need any padding on that side. On the bottom I put 50 pixels to push this line down, the horizontal rule down, to give me more space on the bottom. And I put 150 pixels on this side so that that centered box, this would move more toward the center of the centered box. So that's what I did with the 2 divs. And that second div, if you look, is starting right here. It includes that H3 heading to keep it together with this, and all my entire unordered list is inside that div. Okay, so the last thing that I wanted you to see is this one and this one right here. The UL is our unordered list, means it's got bullets. This is my list of my favorite artists, and I have them listed in no particular order. So I have a selector of unordered list, and inside the declaration here, I gave it a color. The color goes on the letters and on the bullets. The bullets and the letters both take the color because I put it in the unordered list. It has a color of 00FF00, which is the same as this color up here, that bright green, so that it will stand out and be readable against that background. I have the font family is Verdana, which is the same as the body text over here, again because I want that very readable. And I put a font size of 16 points. So these are 14 points. I wanted this a little bit larger because I wasn't bolding it. I wanted to make it very readable, but I wanted to still keep it smaller than the H3, which was 24. So I managed to do that using that UL selector and this declaration here with 1, 2, 3 properties and 1, 2, 3 values. All right, and again, making sure the formatting is done correctly. You're going to lose some points in your CSS, not by whether you included all of these things, but what you did include. How does it look here, and what does it do, and did you format it correctly? Finally is the citation. So the citation is this down at the bottom. And again, this is a little bit of text, but just by using cite, it already automatically puts it in italics. I wanted the font to match the fonts here. So even though it's italic and smaller, I gave it a font family and a font color. I went with a yellowy color, but not as bright as this yellow, because this is the kind of thing you want people to see and know it's copyrighted. I got the color, I got the font family Verdana to match here, and I put a little bit of padding around it so that it wasn't so close up to the horizontal rule. It bounced it off, and it also gave a little space under it. I didn't want too much padding because then you have a huge, pretty empty section at the bottom. Just enough to give it a little bit of space there. So that's the citation section. So those are kind of really the requirements. The requirements are not which particular ones you use. Down here I was very particular about which tags I wanted you to use and how I wanted you to use the attributes. You are required to have this HTML tag to start your style and close the HTML tag. And you are required to have some stuff in here that's going to make your page go from just being a white, boring page to something that's pretty nice looking. I put it out so you should be able to see the whole page now. So now you can see that the whole page has got some nice design to it. It's a good About Me page. Probably doesn't have enough content in there. I'd like to see you have some more content in there. But it's got everything that's required. You have body paragraphs, you got headings, you got some decorative items like the horizontal rules and the box and the drop shadows. Those are all decorative to make it designerly and look nice. You need to have some sort of plan. I chose several green colors and a couple of yellow colors, and I even picked a red accent color, which I didn't end up using. I have 2 hyperlinks. I have the teach over here, and I did not format those because we haven't learned how to format hyperlinks yet in CSS. I didn't feel that it was fair to put those in for this project. They're going to go on the next project. All right, but if you turn in something that looks something like this, I don't want you to obviously copy my page. I want you to use your own fonts and your own design ideas and put things in boxes as you need them, but make it look nice. Make it look really strong. And don't forget, when you turn in your project, I need to see not just the HTML page, but if you have pictures that are included or anything else that you've put into the page that is separate, I have to have it in the same folder or I would not be able to see the picture, where it goes, how it lines up, how big it is. So to get full credit, I need you to turn in the pictures also with the HTML and CSS. All right? So if you have any questions or concerns, reach out to me and we will start the next project coming up soon.